I think there's some folks here who would rather not hear quite that loudly. It's a little hard to doze off, and I know there's several folks who miss an opportunity to doze off if it's too loud, so I always feel sorry for those people who'd rather not hear and can't help it sometimes, so maybe we can get that down just a tad, please. Okay. Blake's good to see you tonight, my friend. Good to see you. The preacher said, and he's right, we're finishing up Mark chapter 8, and we're going to go into chapter 9. He always basically covers it before I get started. I frankly don't even know why I bother, and probably nobody else does either. Pretty much after the preacher's covered it, we might as well just pick it up and go home. Whatever the case, we have a few things to say, perhaps additionally, and a few points to make as well. I do want to pick it up at the end of chapter 8, and we are beginning, as the preacher suggested, with verse 27. And Jesus went out and his disciples into the towns of Caesarea Philippi, and by the way, he asked his disciples, saying unto them, Whom do men say that I am? It's not the only gospel that records this conversation, incidentally, but we have it here. And they, that would be the disciples, answered, John the Baptist. In other words, this is who some people say you are. Some say Elias or Elijah, and others one of the prophets. And he saith unto them, But whom say ye that I am? Peter answered and saith unto him, Thou art the Christ. Ultimately, that question that he asked, But whom say ye that I am, is a question that everybody pretty much has to answer. I think everybody knows that. At the end of the day, it may be of interest to say who others say that he is, and some people get it right, some people get it wrong. But the only question the answer to which really matters, as far as each of us concerns who we say that he is. So he said, Who do you say that I am? And Peter, bless his heart, said, Thou art the Christ. Another, in Matthew, I think it is, it says, Thou art the Christ, the Son of the living God, was the answer that Peter gave. And Jesus responded to him and said, well, he doesn't respond to him here. He charged them they should tell no man. In Matthew, he said, Blessed art thou, Simon Bar-Jonah. What you just said was not revealed by flesh and blood, but my Father which is in heaven. So we see Peter here absolutely speaking words that he, according to Jesus, got from God. As difficult as it is to visualize, we may juxtapose or lay those side by side with a verse in verse 32, of course, when he says something else altogether differently. When something else comes up altogether differently. And there it seems like that Peter is speaking words given to him by somebody other than God. In any event, Jesus said to them, so Peter says, Thou art the Christ, and he said to them, Jesus said to the disciples, listen, let's just hold that back. Let's not talk about that. Now, we've had conversations about this, not every week, but often, about why Jesus would say that sometimes, about a healing he did or something, why he just says, don't talk about that, at least not now. Of course, something comes up, the preacher mentioned it as well at the beginning of chapter 9, again, when Jesus admonishes certain ones, don't talk about it. So now we might wonder, I do, I'm sorry, maybe somebody's getting, is going to say, okay, Coppock, get off of this, but I clearly wonder why he would say that. Why he would say, when Peter nailed it, he just nailed it. And he says, and Jesus responds, that came from God. What you just got came from God. He didn't say that in Mark, but he says in Matthew. So clearly, so that's where he got it. So here's wisdom from God, and Jesus said, let's just don't talk about it. Anybody? Whatever we would say, and there's a couple places along here tonight where I'm going to ask them, why do you think that happened that way? One of the things that I sometimes talk about when we're talking about a place in Scripture where we're trying to decide, what it means or what's there. The one thing that I think is important to remember, I've pointed this out before, but obviously I may do it again after tonight too, but if we needed to know to get what God intended us to get from this particular portion of Scripture, he'd tell us. So we don't have to have that information to get what God intended us to get from this portion of Scripture. At the same time, since he said this, I of course, I just wonder. The best guess, and my guess, whether it's the best one or not, is that the timing wasn't right, that somehow it wouldn't fit with what his ministry was at the time if people began too early to identify him that way. And let's also be clear that most of the people who had been looking for the Messiah all the years that they'd been looking, that the Messiah had been promised, were not, they really weren't expecting something quite like this. And so maybe more like the triumphal ride into Jerusalem on Palm Sunday was more what some people might have been expecting. But for whatever the reason, whatever the case, Jesus said, "You got it, Peter, but let's not talk about it." And that's what he said. And he began to teach them, back in verse 31, he began to teach them, Jesus began to teach the disciples that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected of the elders and the chief priests and scribes, and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. I want to come back to that verse, but look what he says in verse 13, what we read in verse 13. And he spake that openly, I'll stop right there, we'll come back to the rest of that verse in a moment. So there had been times when Jesus, through parables or whatever, had let the disciples know, and those who were listening to him, that he was, what was going to happen. That there was going to come a time when he was going to be put to death, and that he would rise again. And I would tell you, I've looked fairly carefully, and I'm fairly certain about this. But every time he says he's going to be killed, he talks about rising again. In other words, he never leaves himself in the grave, and I don't think there's an exception to that. Whatever the case, he said this openly. In other words, it really it was coming to the time. I'm with you. It was coming to the time when he was coming to the end of his ministry. We now know that based upon the circumstances around what happened here, that he was coming to the end, and now he's telling them in a language that cannot be misunderstood. Sometimes we get messages from the Lord through Scripture and through teachers and so forth, and we have the opportunity to apply those to ourselves, and we have the opportunity to say, okay, that speaks to me, that fits me. The preacher stepped on my toes again today, or whatever we can apply. And sometimes we get that message in that message in a clear, it cannot be misunderstood. And you know what? I really appreciate the fact, because I can misunderstand things, and I appreciate the fact that sometimes I get instruction from the Word, and I get instruction from those who have spiritual authority over me in a language that cannot be misunderstood. And Jesus told them in a language that cannot be misunderstood, I'm going to tell you something, I'm going to be killed. These elders, the leaders, all these people, scribes, these folks are going to kill me, and I will rise again. He said that in a language that could not be misunderstood. He said it openly, clearly, could not be misunderstood. And that's when Peter responded again. And this time he rebuked him. And Peter took him, Jesus, and began to rebuke him. So now he's finding fault with what Jesus said. This is why, I don't know how many minutes passed, but it certainly appears to have been part of the same conversation, part of the same interaction, when he says, "Who do men say that I am? Who do you say that I am?" He said, "You're the Christ." And then he begins to rebuke him. And whatever he said, it's almost incomprehensible to me that Peter could remember or focused on the fact that he was talking to the one that he was talking to the Messiah, the Christ, and he had the audacity, the temerity, or whatever it is, to begin to rebuke him. But he did. He began to rebuke Jesus like, no, that's just not going to happen. And then Jesus turns to him and says, but when he had turned about, that's Jesus, and looked on his disciples, he rebuked Peter, saying, "Get thee behind me, Satan, for thou savorest not the things that be of God, but the things that be of men." Clearly what Jesus is saying here is, you see things from a worldly perspective, Peter. You don't understand the big picture. You don't know what I know. You don't know what God knows. You should not second guess me or God. And he attributes this assertion that Peter was making, he attributes this to Satan. So these in this very short, brief period of time, we see Peter speaking on words that God gave him, and then speaking words and actions that can only be attributed to Satan in the same few moments of time. That's Peter, bless his heart. Whatever the case, Jesus made it crystal clear this was going to happen, and that Peter was speaking as men perceive things to be. You know, it is, bless you, it is, of course, let me start that differently. Peter probably is not the only one in the history of mankind who has looked at something that God has asserted in his word or through his messenger and or messengers and determined that really can't be what God says. I mean, that can't be it. I mean, that's just not like what I would expected God to say. Let's remember this and never forget it. And never forget it. We see things from a worldly perspective. And we see things that make sense to us. And sometimes the things that we see that make so much sense to us are things that God, in fact, planned. I mean, this is what God had for us. I mean, that's exactly the way it was. And sometimes it's altogether different. Yeah, it is. Yeah, it is. Peter, he got off because he looked at things. He said, this is the Messiah. He's not going to kill the Messiah. Why would he kill the Messiah? We just got him. This is Peter's perspective. Of course, he didn't see the big picture. And can I tell you something? Are we blessed? Are we blessed that Jesus got it right and Peter got it wrong? Are we blessed? Would we be lost in our sin had Peter gotten it right and Jesus got it wrong? I'm so thankful that he knew better, and he told Peter, I mean, clear the way that it was, just what you got came from Satan. That's really what it is. He clearly wasn't calling Peter Satan. He was again identifying the source of this thought that Peter was asserting at the time. Anybody with a thought on those first verses, the interaction that he had with relative to him asking, who do men say, who do you say, I'm going to die and be raised again? And anybody with a thought on those verses before we move on? It's a slightly different subject. Same interaction we have beginning with 34. And when he called the people unto him, so this, you see, there's a slight little some little transition period here. And called the people unto him with his disciples also. He said unto them, whosoever, will come after me, let him deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. For whosoever will save his life shall lose it, but whosoever shall lose his life for my sake, and the gospel is the same, shall save it. Now, this is a kind of a, I think the word is a paradox, or so something that's a little hard to understand, where if you want to save your life, you lose it. If you want to lose your life, if you want to save your life, you lose it. If you're going to lose your life if you try to save it, that's really, I guess, what he's saying. But clearly, he's making a point here that there is, hello class, there's a cost associated. There is. There are folks who have this, and I'm not mentioning any names. You can find them on TV most any Sunday and sometimes other days in the week, who espouse or who preach some kind of a religion, for want of a better term, or some kind of a way, for want of a better term, which can only be described as easy believism, or it's something where there's no cost associated. But let me just tell you this: there is a cost associated. There is. It seems to me we do people a great disservice by suggesting to them that there are no circumstances under which there's something they might have to give up, probably will have to make some choices that they might not have otherwise made. And maybe some relationships that will not be what they were before. That there is a cost associated, but these next verses put it into perspective. So basically, what he says with verses 34 and 35: whoever's going to follow me, deny himself, take up a cross, and follow me. Who shall save his life shall lose it. Who shall lose his life for my sake, the gospel, the same shall save it. And here's what he says: this is where he identifies, of course, what this all means. For what shall it profit a man if he shall gain the whole world and lose his own soul? Or what shall a man give in exchange for his soul? Those two questions are, I think, appropriately called rhetorical questions. And rhetorical questions, the answer is implied. As a matter of fact, in law, a rhetorical question is considered to be an assertion. And you are asserting a point when you ask a question that the answer is implied. And the answer clearly is implied here. I'm just going to tell you something. Anybody who sat down and thought about it, who really believed it, would have a hard time saying, I would give up my soul for anything else. For anything else. What does it profit a man if he gain the whole world and lose his own soul? Those verses, of course, follow the verses just preceding that. Of course they do. But where the suggestion is there is a cost associated with following. But what's it going to gain if a person loses his own soul? What would a man give in exchange for his soul? And we can all think of people who have a whole lot today. They have a whole lot. We have a whole lot compared to the majority of the people on this planet. But there are people who have a whole lot. But I have to tell you something. There isn't anybody who has anything that is more valuable than their own soul. They just don't. And we clearly don't. And anybody who puts something, anything, in front of their own soul, clearly was that was foolish beyond any doubt. It's just foolish. The answer is implied by these two questions. What man give in exchange for his soul? I want you to look at the last verse of this chapter, because I want to tell you something. This verse can be slightly troubling, and I want to be sure that we get what it says, and we don't get anything more than that. The last verse says, whosoever therefore, still in the same context of this conversation, shall be ashamed of me and my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, of him also shall the Son of Man be ashamed when he cometh in his glory, when he cometh in the glory of his Father and the holy angels. What on earth can that mean? Somebody's ashamed of me, and I'm going to be ashamed of him, or her. I'm pretty sure that's what it says. At a particular time, on a particular occasion, under a particular circumstance. Be careful. Don't go any further than that. This does not say anything more than it says. And what it says is, somebody's ashamed of me here. When I come in my glory with the glory of my Father and with the holy angels, I'm going to be ashamed of that person when I come. When I come, that's when he's going to be ashamed. I'm just going to tell you that's kind of hard. I would be really surprised, Ed, if very many people haven't had an occasion when they avoided saying something they might otherwise have said because of people that were close by listening. I'd be really surprised. Take much time to tell this story, but the last two Fridays, Saturdays, Sundays, last 3 weekends, Sunday afternoon, I teach a class, law students, and this past Sunday, just a few days ago, I was teaching, the weekend of this last weekend was teaching them a skill, all right, some folks say it is, of a particular way to make an argument, part of an argument, and a closing argument to a jury. In any event, the opportunity was for them, each of them, to make their argument, and of course, then the student that went before them, the student went after them, critiqued, and then I, of course, critiqued them, and then we went to the next person. Anyway, one of the students got up, and he was making his argument. He was fairly good, and he used what is commonly referred to as a four-letter word. Now, I would probably tell you what that word was in context, except this is recorded, and I'm sorry, I'm not putting that out there, so I'm not going to do that. So, in any event, he used what's commonly referred to as a four-letter word. And I thought about it for a minute. I'm sitting there, I'm thinking, okay, well, you know what? I mean, I don't know. I don't know whether I need to say anything or not. I'm not sure. First of all, it was a weekend class. I'd never seen the kid before. About half of the students in there I'd had in other classes, but I really hadn't made up my mind whether to say anything or not when it came my turn to critique. And so, in any event, the first one of the students afterwards, she said, he did this right, did that, whatever, he might have done this differently. And she said, when you said that word, and she said it let me know that you're just a real person, and I appreciated you saying that. Well, I'm sorry, now it's 2 times. I have to say, I'm sorry, I cannot let that go. I'd be really happy if that was turned down just a little bit. Thank you, I hope. In any event, so, I said what I needed to say about the rest of his argument. Then I said, you know what? There's probably only 6 people in this county who are offended by words that are sometimes characterized as four-letter words. Probably only 6, 5 plus your professor. Just so you know. I doubt that anybody would be offended, although we had somebody here thought that was really special. So maybe, some folks who think it's pretty good. I don't know. All of you have been in my class, you may think less of me because you've never heard those words come out of my mouth, and you're not going to. So, besides that, I just said it's time for the closing prayer and a hymn, and if we can take an offering, we're out of here. And, of course, everybody was happy. But I'm sorry I can't let it go. One of the reasons that I hesitate, I'm trying to decide, do I really want to make a point in front of these students that I'm weird? I am. I'm sorry. Bless your heart, so are you. Quit looking at me like you are. So So I don't know. I can tell you this. There have been times in my life when I have not, because I really didn't want to come across that way. And I can make all kind of excuses. I may be the only person here tonight having ever done that, but I doubt that. I doubt that. I do. In any event, I have another translation for this verse, and I'd like to read it to you. Again, I've used this translation on more than one occasion. It's the Message, which is my favorite modern translation. It says, if any of you are embarrassed over me and the way I'm leading you when you get around your fickle and unfocused friends, know that you'll be an even greater embarrassment to the Son of Man when he arrives in all the splendor of God, his Father, and with his army of holy angels. Let me just say this. I don't know exactly what's going to happen. I do know when this is going to happen. It's when he comes back. I mean, that's really what it sounds like to me. There's an occasion when there will be a time when we will not, his response to us will be different than we wish it were. I mean, that's really what the verse says, and it's hard to read it any other way. But let me just say this. When you're in a position to either acknowledge or to avoid any comment that would give away your relationship with the Lord, you be careful before you let that go. Just be careful. That if you let it go, it is not because you were embarrassed to identify with him. Just be careful. Just be careful. I'm pretty sure that's what the verse says. I'm pretty sure that's what it says. And I don't really want to add anything to what it says. I don't want to make it more important than it is. But neither do I want to take away from anything that it says either. Anybody, that's chapter 8. Anybody with a comment before we go to chapter 9? Anyone at all? So Harry and B are in another country, so I can always count on at least one of them. So we're okay. We're okay. We're going to chapter 9. And you folks would recognize, of course, the events that transpire here. And I want to spend a few moments as we go through some of these. As I read what others have said about these verses, these chapters, and also, of course, as you look at this, most folks who have commented on this point think this is an unfortunate break in the chapters. In other words, this could have been the next verse. Chapter 9, verse 1 could have been the next verse in chapter 8. But of course, I mean, I'm sorry, this chapter has 50 verses. I mean, you've got to break somewhere, I suppose you do. So whatever they do break here. But it's part of the same period of time that we begin chapter 9. And he said unto them, this would be Jesus talking to the group, clearly including his disciples, verily I say unto you, there be some of them that stand here which shall not taste death till they have seen the kingdom of God come with power. And after 6 days, Jesus taketh with him Peter, James, and John. I believe it's Luke that says 8 days. Well, of course, they counted days a little differently. Sometimes they count the end of one and the beginning of another. That's how we get 3 days, of course, at the crucifixion to the resurrection. Because the days were counted a little differently. I'm going to tell you this. This is right, and so is the other one. I'm just telling you, that neither one is wrong. I'm just going to tell you that. So that's how I think that we'd explain this saying 6 days and the other one saying 8. I think it's Luke. In fact, I'm pretty sure it is. After 6 days, he taketh with him Peter, James, and John, and leadeth them up into a high mountain apart by themselves, and he was transfigured before them. Now I'm going to ask you in a few moments, why Peter, James, and John? Why Peter, James, and John? His disciples were there. We identified them earlier in Mark, and we went through their names. Everybody's gotten hold of those. There were 12, weren't there? Now we know, and Jesus knew, and it was coming towards the end, that one of those was different than the others. But among the 11, then, Judas Iscariot aside, among the 11, he chose these 3. And it says he took them. He didn't ask for volunteers. Anybody, you mind climbing a mountain with me? I got some. No. He took those 3. Anybody?
I think, in my opinion, and that, for what it's worth.
Thank you. So Tom starts out by saying, in my opinion, for what that's worth. And first of all, thank you for acknowledging it is your opinion, and thank you as well for acknowledging that it's Tom's opinion, right? I'm sorry. How bad can it be? I'm sorry, go ahead.
Because Peter, James, and John were normally the most voiceful.
The most voiceful. Certainly Peter was. I don't think we have many examples of James or John.
James and John, didn't they want to be at the left and the right?
James and John, their mother went to
Sons of Thunder?
the James and John their mother went to Jesus to try to figure out who, if one could sit on one and one on the other. But I don't know. But I'm not sure that qualified them for this special blessing. I don't know that it did. I mean, yes, ma'am.
Were they the first disciples that he called?
They actually were not. So that's okay. Andrew went and got Peter. Andrew was before Peter. And so we had two brothers there, two siblings, and James and John. First of all, I think we don't know why he did. We just don't know why he did. But for some reason, we do know that John was described as the disciple that Jesus loved. So he had a special affection apparently for John, but that doesn't explain James to me. And Peter, we've just talked about Peter. So the answer is I don't think we know why. But this we do know. For some reason, let's go with the 11. He chose 3 out of the 11 and took them for a very, very special blessing. He did. These 3. They saw something. They experienced something that none of the others did. In fact, as no other person has ever done. No other human has ever done. Those three. He also had an occasion when this was all over, of course, when he gave them the instruction, don't talk about it. And we have no evidence or no indication that they ever did say anything about it. He said till after the resurrection, don't say anything else about it. But he chose those 3. Now, here's what I think we get from that. As far as we know, the other 8 were loved by Jesus. They served Jesus. They sweat with Jesus. When they had to share or they got hungry, they were with Jesus. As far as we know, the other 8 were all martyred for Jesus, as was 2 of the 3 that went up on the mountain with him. As far as we know, Jesus wasn't mad at the other 8, but for some reason, 3 of them got a special blessing. And I don't know if this applies today or not. I'm not sure, but I do know on this occasion at least, people who were doing the same kinds of things, as far as we know, involved in the same kinds of activities, working, as far as we know, there's no indication that some of them worked harder, worked later, got up earlier. He just chose 3. Now, I have seen occasions, you may have as well, when it seems like you have 2 people or 3 people or 13 people, and they're all working hard. I think of preachers sometimes. They're about the stuff. I mean, they're staying with the stuff. They're working hard. And for some reason, it seems like the blessings are not evenly distributed. I mean, you'd think that you took 2 people or 3 people or 6 people, and you said, if you all do these exact same things, the results will be the same. But that's not the way it is. It's rarely the way it is. For whatever reason, Jesus chose these 3 for a blessing, unlike any blessing that he was prepared apparently to bestow or give to the other 8. Again, we have no reason to suppose those others weren't faithful. One of those wrote the first gospel that we read about, and we consider him an authority. And again, Andrew was the one, I think it was Uncle Tom that was pointing out that Andrew's the one who was always going out and getting people, bringing to Jesus or whatever. He was on fire. Andrew was. I don't know why. I don't know what Thaddeus ever did. I don't know what's the problem or what Nathaniel did. I don't know. All I know is that for some reason Jesus chose this, and you know what? This is an opinion. I think he still does. I think there are still circumstances under which Jesus chooses to bless differently. And you know what? He knows. Whatever the case, he did here. So let's look what happened. These 3 go up here. And incidentally, in our other Gospels, we find out that these old boys went to sleep, kind of like they did in Gethsemane. They did. They went to sleep. And they had to be roused from their sleep. I'm talking about the 3 guys who went up with him. So, one more time, I guess he didn't choose them for their stamina, but or their insomnia or whatever, because it was kind of like at Gethsemane. They went to sleep, got up on the mountain, and went to sleep. In any event, he was transfigured before them. At the end of verse 2, verse 3, in his raiment, Jesus' raiment, became shining, exceeding white as snow, as no fuller. A fuller was a person, of course, they did laundry. They cleaned things. There was no fuller on earth can white them. His raiment, his clothes was whiter than any. Anybody on earth could have ever made it. And there appeared unto them Elias, that would be Elijah, with Moses, and they were talking with Jesus. Now, here's the thing. We read, again, it's in Matthew, that what they were talking about. We're told what they're talking about. You know what? I'm sorry, it's in Luke 9:31. What they were talking about, we're not told in Mark what they were talking about. They were talking about when Jesus was going to Jerusalem and was going to die. That's what they were talking about. So you have these three here talking, and I want you to picture that for a second. I think it'll help us to picture these three guys standing there talking, these three men standing there talking. The law, the prophets, and the Son of God. That's who was there. One was the one who'd written down the law. One was one of the major prophets, of course, and the Son of God. We're talking. I did my best to figure out how long after Moses had died before Elijah was born. And it's a little difficult to tell. We don't know exactly the years that Moses lived. It was somewhere between 1800 and 1600 BC. He lived 120 years, I'm pretty sure about that. And then we don't know about Elijah so much, except there is a record that Elijah wrote to Jehoram, who was the son of Jehoshaphat. Jehoshaphat being the fourth king of Judah, and Jehoram being the fifth king. So he wrote a letter to Jehoram. Presumably he was alive when Jehoram was alive. And we know then that there was probably somewhere around 800 years. Not a big deal, 800 to maybe 850 years between when Moses died and when Elijah was born. In other words, members of the jury, they had never met before. Now, I know that sometimes people speculate about what we're going to be able to do in heaven. I mean, in our glorified bodies, what options are we going to have? You know, I sometimes say, semi tongue-in-cheek, you know, when I get there, I'm going to ask this question. I want to find out what Jesus wrote in the sand. I'm going to ask Daniel about, whatever. I'm going to ask those people those things. And sometimes I think there's some folks who think we probably won't be doing that. Well, I got to tell you something. These guys did. First of all, they knew each other. I'm talking now about Elijah, Moses. They knew each other, and they had a conversation. Would have been nice to overhear it. Presumably, even if it was a recording, it wasn't in English. Besides that, if it had been in English, BW couldn't have understood it anyway. He speaks in hillbilly grunt, and that doesn't count. But I'm sure it wasn't in that. But whatever the case, it would be sure interesting to hear the conversation. We do know from another gospel what they were talking about. But there they were. They knew each other. They had never met. They had a conversation, and I am persuaded that it's anecdotal evidence, but it's evidence that we're going to have these same kinds of opportunities, and surely there's time's not going to be a limit. Won't it be wonderful to have all these questions answered, to meet these people, meet these men and women who are pillars of the faith, and just have them explain how things happened. And Jesus was part of that conversation too, and I'm persuaded he'll be part of ours too. And I just think that was really something. I'm trying to think of an experience that any three humans, referring now to Peter, James, and John, who almost slept through it. Any kind of an experience that any human has had which quite matches that. That must have been really something. Seeing Jesus transfigured, having a conversation with two Old Testament saints. Whatever the case, there they were. And Peter answered and said, they were talking with Jesus. And Peter answered and said unto Jesus, I'm in verse 5 now, Master, it's good for us to be here. I bet it was. Let us make 3 tabernacles, one for thee, one for Moses, and one for Elias. Now here's I get it that Peter was the talker. He said things. And maybe other people think those same kinds of things, and he's the one. People say that sometimes. Peter speaks up what other people were thinking. I don't know whether they were thinking this or not. I don't know. I mean, I'm sure that James and John were happy to be there as well. I mean, when they roused themselves, one of the Gospels again tells us that that those 3 guys had to be roused, but when they were roused, they were happy to be there. But I want you to think about what Peter said. If there's a better example of a mountaintop experience, one more time, I'm having trouble thinking of one. This was a certified, gold-plated mountaintop experience. And Peter wanted to hang out there. He wanted to stay there. The thing that, and I get that. I mean, I think we get that. I don't think anybody's going to say, I can't wait to leave. I mean, I think we get that. But Peter was perfectly happy to build tabernacles and stay when there were people in the valley who were in trouble. And we read in one of the verses coming up real soon, the other 9 disciples were in trouble in the valley. And sometimes believers want to cloister themselves with others and have just praise the Lord and bless the Lord, oh my soul. That's a wonderful thing. But sometimes there's people in the valley that need help. And that was not to be. They were not to stay on that mountaintop. Even though it was a totally wonderful time, they needed to be somewhere else. But I just want to tell you something. There's nobody here is. It's not like I'm saying something differently than I'm miscommunicating. Nobody is suggesting that it's not a totally wonderful thing to have opportunities for fellowship and worship and just totally get into the occasion when we're together. But let us remember and never forget that there are people sometimes that need us, and we need to get out. I'm sorry, we just need to get out of here. We just need to get out and get with the people that need the help. So that was an issue there. Peter, whatever, he didn't. All right. The other disciples is verse 14. They needed them big time. They needed them, and when they got down, you of course see, or you already know perhaps why they had trouble, but they did. There's another thing that I would mention before we leave the mountain, was that Jesus, again, if you picture this, it may help. It helps me. Jesus was conversing with Elijah and Moses. Now, these weren't foreigners to Jesus because he was in heaven when they got there, or what he knew them well, and there wasn't something he was trying to learn that he didn't know. But I'm sorry, that's a big deal. He's transfigured in his transfigured form. He's speaking to, and Peter butts in. He butts in. And there's no indication here. Others, Gospels suggest that, that Jesus responded to Peter. He allowed him to interrupt his conversation with Moses and Elijah without a rebuke. Sometimes when we are having a conversation or some kind of interaction, maybe with people who we think are pretty important, and there are some important people. There are. And we are less inclined to deign to allow ourselves to be interrupted by somebody who we think is less important. If there was ever an occasion that Jesus might have said, "I'm sorry, buddy, just butt out, would you please? I got something going on here. I'll get to you in a minute." No indication whatsoever to say anything like that. I have to tell you, we need to be careful. We need to be careful that we don't get to the place, we don't have an occasion when we think we're involved in something that's really important and somebody who's not so important wants or needs attention. We need to be gracious, clearly the way that Jesus was. All right. Okay, for he wist not, this is Peter verse 6 again. For he wist not what to say, for they were sore afraid. He really didn't know what to say, he just said what he said. And there was a cloud that overshadowed them, verse 7, and a voice came out of the cloud saying, "This is my beloved Son, hear ye him." Okay, and suddenly they looked round about, verse 8, and they saw no man any more save Jesus, only with themselves. And as they came down from the mountain, he charged them, Jesus charged the other three, Peter, James, and John, they should tell no man what they had seen till the Son of Man were risen from the dead. As far as we know, they complied. And now, I don't know why he did that. I don't know why he did that. I don't know why they couldn't go down and say, you will not believe what just happened. But I'm just going to tell you it did. You saw it, didn't you, Peter? Yeah, I saw it too. One of the advantages to the disciples was the following. One of the problems sometimes that people have is they get a puffed up view of themselves because they have perhaps been blessed in a particular way. They have maybe some kind of a testimony that perhaps sets them apart because the Lord has done something really special in their lives. And sometimes it's difficult for people who have been in that situation to be humble about it. These guys didn't have any trouble being humble because they were told not to tell. I mean, there was no chance, and we do know they had an issue with this, don't we? Because a little bit later on, in this same chapter, they're talking about who's going to be the greatest in the kingdom. So there was this rivalry in and amongst the disciples. But these three guys who had this special experience were specifically forbidden from telling. I don't know if you've ever had a secret before that was, it was really good. It's assertive. I'm not necessarily talking about a present at Christmas time, although it could be that too. But I'm talking about some really, really good. See, it's hard. It is hard. It is hard. It can be painful sometimes because and they were forbidden from telling. And as far as we know, they never told. And the upside for them at least was there was nothing they could brag about. I can tell you it's kind of a wonderful spot to be in, whether you know what I'm talking about or not. I really don't have much to brag about. I don't really. If you don't have much to brag about, there's not much chance of you falling into this terrible sin called pride, and whatever they might have. I don't know why he said that. I really don't. But I do know that at a minimum they could not use this as an example of why they should be so great. They had nothing to brag about because they weren't allowed to brag. Whatever the case, and they kept this saying with themselves, questioning one another. I'm on verse 10 now. Questioning another what the rising from the dead should mean. Okay, we go, of course, back to when he had said he was going to be killed and raised from the dead. And they ask him, saying, these are the disciples, why say the scribes that Elias or Elijah must come first? Now, these next few verses may seem like they don't necessarily fit with some of the others, but this was part of the conversation. We're going to go through it. So they're saying, why did the scribes say that Elias must come first? And he, Jesus, answered and told them, Elias verily, truly cometh first and restoreth all things, how it is written of the Son of Man, that he must suffer many things and be set at naught. So he's saying Elijah did come. But I say unto you that Elijah is indeed come. They have done unto him whatsoever they listed, as it is written of him. Anybody know who he's talking about? I'm sorry? Brenda whispered the answer in the preacher's ears. I think that's why he gets things right sometimes, because Brenda helps him, because clearly someone sort of needs to, but we're not going to spend much time there. We're not going to. No, I'm serious. He's referring to John the Baptist, and of course that was in the spirit of Elijah that John the Baptist, and it's one reason by some folks associated with him with that, because that's what the prophecy was, that he would come, and what Jesus described there is exactly what happened to John. Of course, he came, did what he was supposed to. He told what was going to be happening soon, and they did with him what they chose to do with him was, of course, they took off his head, which we talked about one of the earlier weeks on this, and so that's really what that's talking about. Most of the ancient writers and some contemporaries, there are some folks who wonder if that's really what he was talking about. I don't know who else it could be. I don't know who else it could be. Who else fits that description? John the Baptist fits it to a T. So I'm pretty sure that's who he's referencing. And when he came to his disciples, he saw a great multitude about them. So now here he is. He's on the way down the mountain, and he has this conversation about Elias, Elijah. And when he came to his disciples, now he's talking about the others. Now he's talking about the other 9 that were there. He saw a great multitude about them, and the scribes questioning with them. And straightway all the people, when they beheld him, were greatly amazed, running to him, and saluted him. This makes you think a little bit of Moses when he came down off the mountaintop, having spent time with the Lord, and he comes down, and everybody, it's like they never expected to see him again for some reason. And the implication here is it's like he's gone. We're not sure he was going to come back. Well, he did, didn't he? Moses did, of course, and Jesus did as well. It's one reason why it just seems a little bit like that. And he, Jesus, asked the scribes, what question ye with them? So here's what was happening. The scribes were putting his disciples on the spot. This is why they needed help. These disciples were in a fix. They had, we get with these next verses, and I'll do my best to get them. They had made an effort to cast a demon out of a boy. And they were supposed to be able to do that. They had done it. But for some reason, they couldn't on this one, and the scribes were putting them on the spot. The scribes were mocking them because they were supposed to be so powerful, and allegedly had cast out demons. They actually had, but for this particular one, they couldn't, and the scribes were harassing them. No other way to look at this. And one of the multitude answered and said, Master, I'm in verse 17, I have brought unto thee my son, which hath a dumb spirit. He couldn't speak. And wheresoever he taketh him, he teareth him. This is talking about the spirit now. And he, my son, foameth and gnasheth with his teeth, and pineth away. And I spake to thy disciples that they should cast him out, and they could not. So he said, here's the problem. The dad saying to Jesus, here's the problem. I brought my son. He's got this spirit indwelling him who keeps him from speaking, and he also creates all sorts of issues. I brought him to the disciples to get him cast out, and they couldn't get it done. They weren't able to. And he, Jesus, answered him and said, O faithless generation, how long shall I be with you? How long shall I suffer you? Bring him unto me. Now, it's not clear to hear, and there's different people think he's talking to the group as a whole. Others think that he's perhaps talking to these disciples who had been unsuccessful at casting out this demon. Whatever the case, Jesus expresses some frustration. I'm not sure that that's exactly the best word to describe it, but he's saying, you know what, I've been here, I've been working, I've been teaching, and when are you going to get it? When is this going to come through? Do you think he ever possibly gets frustrated with some people today? I'm just asking. I'm sorry. I've met with you. I've saved you. You have seen me work in your life. I have provided for you, and you still have issues that should be solved by now. One could suppose that at some point he would just say, wait a minute. After what I've done for you, you still have this question, or you still have this issue, or whatever. This is his response to this. I really want to do my best to finish this. And then they brought him, that's the boy, unto him. And when he saw him, straightway the spirit tore the boy. He fell on the ground, wallowing and foaming. And he asked his father, Jesus said to the father, how long is it ago since this came unto him? And he said, of a child. Now here's the thing. Jesus asked this question, how long has this been going on? And the father said, since he was just a kid. Well, first of all, let's agree, Jesus knew the answer to the question. He knew the answer to the question. I was going to ask you why, but let me just tell you why. The only thing I think that he could possibly have asked that question is so that everybody else could see as well. This one's been here a while. This has been here a while. Hello, this is the only thing we know about this demon that's different than the others. The only distinction about this demon and other demons is that he'd been there a while. He'd occupied that kid for a while. He was there. He'd formed a home. He was there. And oft times it hath cast him into the fire. This is the Father still speaking, into the waters, to destroy him. But if thou canst do anything, have compassion on us and help us. Here's the way, this has been a long time going on. And if you can do, I want you to get that word if. Here's what happened. Those disciples had their lack of being able to get this done had cast aspersions on their master, because at some point one would suppose everybody would know Jesus could get this done, but now because his disciples were unsuccessful, because of the testimony of his disciples, because of the way the disciples had responded to this, there was a question about Jesus. Do you think there's ever been an occasion when people wondered about the power of the Lord because his people somehow didn't deal with issues the way they should be dealt with? Does anybody think that's possible? I think it probably is. So he cast a doubt, and there was a doubt in this man's mind because of what he had seen, failed to see on the part of his disciples. The disciples let him down. I'm really sorry. Jesus said, if thou canst believe, all things are possible to him that believeth. He's talking to the Father, and straightway the Father, the child cried out and said with tears, Lord, I believe, help me down my unbelief. I want to just tell you something. He acknowledged something. Anybody here who is blessed enough to have the faith to believe has to acknowledge that there are times when we need help with our unbelief. I'm sorry. There isn't a single soul here. This is my view, and perhaps I'm going too far, but that hasn't had occasions when they've wondered about things for which they should know the answers. And I have to tell you something. I need to pray regularly. I told you, it's the Lord knows my heart. I believe the Lord. But I need help with that sometimes. There are occasions which come up, so circumstances which arise, and I need help with my unbelief. And this father clearly acknowledged, I believe, but just help me. I need help. We need help. We just need help. Well, bless your hearts, the Lord healed the boy, didn't he? And we'll just pick this up another time. I'm sorry that we didn't do better than this. The preacher just always interrupts. You're right, Adam, about the preacher, incidentally. I should have listened to you. And so we'll just have to pick this up another time. And preacher, you'll get us started, I'm sure, when the time comes, and tell us what we'll be talking about when that time comes, just like all the other times there. So.
Definitely.